The knock didn't come politely. It came like someone was trying to break the hinges off my front door. 4 in the morning, pitch black outside, the kind of silence where even the crickets stop because they know something is wrong. I didn't rush. I didn't shout. I stood in the hallway barefoot, listening, while my security camera monitor glowed softly on the wall. On the screen was the HOA president, hair half done, jaw tight with entitlement, one hand raised again to pound the full door, the other already fumbling in her purse like she expected this to end with her walking inside my house. I remember thinking how calm I felt, which surprised me, because by then everything had already been decided. I reached over, hit record on my phone, and waited. Before any of that, before the cameras and the locks and the dogs trained to respond, to silent hand signals, my life was painfully ordinary in the best way. I moved out there for quiet, not power. I had just retired, not rich but comfortable, and what I wanted more than anything was space that didn't belong to anyone else's mood swings. The property wasn't flashy. A modest house set back from the road, trees old enough to remember when the county line was drawn wrong, and land that rolled instead of sitting flat, the kind that made mornings feel earned. I spent my days fixing things slowly, not because they were broken, but because I liked knowing how they worked. Coffee on the porch at sunrise, dogs running the fence line like it was their job because to them it was. I didn't care about community politics, neighborhood gossip, or whatever drama people needed to feel important. I waved when someone waved. That was the extent of my involvement. The HOA technically existed, but it barely touched my property. That wasn't arrogance, it was paperwork. The development had been built decades after my parcel was subdivided, and while their entrance road brushed the edge of my land, my deed predated their bylaws by almost 30 years. At first, they ignored me. That should have been the warning sign. The first letter arrived in a plain white envelope, no return address, taped to my mailbox like someone didn't want to knock. It said I was in violation for unauthorized. Exterior modifications. No explanation, no citation, just a fine amount and a deadline. I thought it was a mistake. I emailed back, polite, attached my survey, pointed out the boundary lines, asked which modification they meant. I even thanked them for their time, because that's the kind of person I was then. They didn't reply. Instead, a second notice came, this time certified, doubling the fine and adding language they clearly copied from somewhere else. It referenced sections of bylaws that didn't apply to me, restrictions on fence height that didn't exist on my parcel, and a demand that I schedule an inspection. That was the first time I felt that slow, sinking feeling that something wasn't just wrong, it was deliberate. I drove to the HOA office during business hours. It was locked. No hours posted. Just a sign with a phone number that went straight to voicemail. I left a message. Calm, clear, documented. A week later, they posted a violation notice directly on my front door, not in an envelope, pinned, like a warning. It claimed I had refused inspection and was now subject to enforcement actions. That was the moment confusion turned into focus. I stopped assuming incompetence and started assuming intent. I printed every email I had sent. I pulled my original deed from the fireproof safe. I laid out the surveys on the kitchen table and traced the boundaries with my finger, slow and methodical. Nothing had changed since the last time I looked, which meant the change wasn't on my side. Neighbors started acting strange. People who used to wave looked away. One woman I'd chatted with once at the feed store crossed the street when she saw me. That told me more than any letter. Someone was talking. Someone was framing a story. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, they were asserting control, and they'd decided I was an easy target because I didn't attend meetings or make noise. I sent one final email attaching the relevant county documents, asking them to confirm in writing that they believed they had jurisdiction over my property. I never got an answer. What I got instead was a notice slipped under my door saying, They would be conducting a mandatory access inspection the following week, with or without my presence. That was when I stopped trying to resolve it socially and started treating it like what it was, a legal problem. I installed additional cameras, not because I was scared, but because evidence is only useful if it exists before you need it. I reviewed state statutes on HOA authority, especially the parts most people never read, the ones about easements, implied access, and limitations when property predates association formation. I called the county clerk and requested archived, plats, not digital copies, originals. It took days. It took patience. It took being very polite to people who were used to being ignored. At night, while the house was quiet, I read until my eyes burned, not with anger, but with the kind of calm you get when pieces start fitting together. The inspection never happened. Instead, they escalated. Fines increased. Language sharpened. One letter used the phrase master access key, which made me laugh out loud when I read it. There is no such thing, legally or practically, for a private residence outside HOA jurisdiction. But the fact they wrote it down told me something important. They believed their own authority was absolute, and that belief was about to make them careless. By the time the knocking started at 4 in the morning, I knew exactly who it was, exactly why she was there, and exactly how this was going to end. I didn't open the door right away. I waited, listening to the dogs shift behind. Me, calm but alert, trained to respond only if I told them to. I took one last look at the documents laid out neatly on the table, every page tabbed, every date highlighted. When I finally stepped toward the door, it wasn't to argue. It was to let her make the mistake she had been building toward for weeks, the one she thought would scare me into compliance. I reached for the handle, already knowing guaranteed silence was about to fall on her, and that everything after this would be permanent. I didn't open the door that night. That's important. People assume the confrontation happened right there, that it was loud or dramatic, but it wasn't. I stood just inside, listening to her demand entry through the thick wood like she owned the place, while my dogs sat perfectly, still behind me, waiting for a command that never came. After a few minutes, she realized no one was coming and stormed off, already rehearsing whatever version of the story she planned to tell next. When the yard finally went quiet again, I locked the deadbolt, turned off the hallway light, and went back to bed. I slept better than I had in weeks, because by then I knew I was no longer reacting. I was controlling the timeline. The next morning felt almost peaceful. Sunlight came through the kitchen window the same way it always did, hitting the edge of the table where my paperwork was spread out like a map. I made coffee, fed the dogs, and sat down to organize everything into a single binder. Not because I needed it, but because presentation matters when you're dealing with people who confuse authority with volume. I labeled sections for deeds, surveys, correspondence, and state statutes. I printed screenshots from my security cameras, time-stamped and clear, showing the HOA president on my porch in the dark. I didn't send anything yet. I wanted them to keep thinking I was still just a homeowner they could intimidate with letters and fines. A few days later, the next escalation arrived exactly on schedule. This one claimed I had refused lawful entry and was now subject to emergency enforcement, including locksmith access if necessary. It cited no statute. It referenced no court order. It was pure bluff and a dangerous one. That's when I called an attorney, not because I needed one to fight, but because I wanted a witness who could later confirm that I had tried to prevent what was coming. He was quiet while I explained, flipping through the documents I emailed him, asking only a few questions about dates and boundaries. When he finally spoke, it was measured. He said they had no authority. He said their letters were reckless. And then he said something that stuck with me. People like this don't stop until they embarrass themselves in front of the wrong audience. The HOA meeting notice came shortly after, posted publicly this time, listing my address as a compliance. issue on the agenda. I didn't attend. That was deliberate. Letting them talk without opposition creates a record, and records matter. Instead, I sent a certified letter requesting copies of the meeting minutes, citing the specific statute that required disclosure. They didn't respond to that either, which told me they weren't interested in legality, only momentum. Meanwhile, neighbors who had been quiet started watching again. I could feel it when I walked the dogs. Curtains moved. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Whatever story the HOA was spreading, it was starting to feel thin, and people could sense a shift coming. I spent those evenings reading old county infrastructure plans, the kind of documents that never get digitized because no one thinks they're important anymore. That's where I found the easement language that changed everything. Not just a boundary line, but a limitation clause buried in a 40-year-old filing that explicitly excluded my parcel from any future association control unless I voluntarily opted in. I hadn't. My previous owner hadn't. No one ever had. That clause was the quiet kill shot, the kind of detail that doesn't look dramatic until you put it in front of a judge or a board that's already overextended. I didn't rush. I cross-referenced it with state law, then with case precedent. Every night, the binder got thicker, heavier, more final. The HOA president tried again, this time during daylight, walking the fence line with another board member and taking photos. I let the cameras capture it. I let the dogs bark once, just enough to remind them where they were. Still, I said nothing. Silence makes people nervous when they expect resistance. A week later, I received a notice of intent to impose a lien. That was the line they shouldn't have crossed. Liens require authority, accuracy, and due process. They had none of the three. I called the county recorder the same day, asked what would happen if someone attempted to file a lien without standing. The clerk didn't hesitate. She said it would trigger an automatic review and potential sanctions. I thanked her and wrote that down too. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, I was ready, but I still didn't go. Instead, I sent my attorney with a sealed envelope addressed to the board, requesting it be entered into the record. Inside was a formal notice of lack of jurisdiction, copies of the deed exclusions, and a warning that any further attempts to access my property would be treated as trespass and harassment under state law. The meeting didn't go the way they expected. Word traveled fast. By the following morning, my phone started ringing with unknown numbers. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The shift had already happened. That night, I stood on the porch with my dogs, listening to the wind move through the trees, and felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief exactly, but certainty. The kind that comes when you realize the outcome is no longer a question of if, but when. They still thought they were in control. They still believed paperwork could be ignored if you acted confident enough. What they didn't understand yet was that confidence without authority collapses the moment it's challenged properly. And the next challenge was coming fast. By the time they realized I wasn't backing down, the tone of their letters changed. The language got stiffer, more formal, like they were trying to borrow authority they didn't actually have. Certified. Envelopes started showing up twice a week, each one heavier than the last, full of threats dressed up as procedure. Fines recalculated. Deadlines moved forward. References to community standards and emergency powers thrown around loosely, as if repetition alone could make them real. I kept everything. I didn't argue. I didn't respond emotionally. I just logged dates, scanned pages, and added tabs to the binder. There's a strange calm that sets in when you stop hoping people will be reasonable and start preparing for them to be exposed instead. The neighbors noticed before the HOA did. People who used to wave now avoided eye contact, not out of hostility but fear. Fear is contagious in communities like that because everyone knows the HOA survives on selective enforcement. If they could come after me this aggressively, anyone could be next. A couple of residents stopped me quietly on evening walks, asking what was really going on. lowering their voices like we were discussing something illegal instead of paperwork. I told them the truth without embellishment. I said I was handling it. I said they should keep their own records. I didn't ask them to take sides. That wasn't necessary. Doubt was already doing the work for me. What the board didn't know was that their own documents were betraying them. Buried in past newsletters and archived meeting minutes were references to legacy parcels and pre-association land agreements, phrases that meant nothing to most homeowners, but meant everything to someone who knew how to trace land use history. I cross-checked those references against county plats and found the original subdivision map, the one filed before the HOA ever existed. My property sat there plainly, outlined but not incorporated, like an afterthought they'd hoped no one would ever revisit. It explained why enforcement against me had always been inconsistent, why previous boards had left the parcel alone. This wasn't oversight. It was institutional amnesia. The real turning point came when the HOA hired outside counsel. That's always the moment when bullies either retreat or double down, because lawyers introduce liability into situations built on bravado. Their attorney sent a formal demand letter asserting control over my driveway, my fence line, even my front gate, citing bylaws that didn't apply and statutes taken out of context. I read it twice, slowly, then forwarded it to my attorney with a single sentence, asking whether it was worth responding yet. He called me instead. He said the letter was sloppy. He said it relied on assumptions that hadn't been true for decades. Then he asked if I was ready to end it because once we moved, it wouldn't be quiet anymore. I told him I was ready, but not to end it. Not yet. The HOA scheduled a special meeting shortly after, opened to residents, closed to questions. That detail mattered. Closed questions meant they wanted control of the narrative, a final show of force. I decided to attend that one. I didn't bring the binder. I brought a thin folder and let the rest stay in the car. Walking into that room, I could feel the tension settle like humidity. The president avoided my eyes. The lawyer smiled the way people do when they think they've already won. They ran through their agenda quickly, saving my item for last, framing it as a compliance issue, a simple misunderstanding that would be resolved through cooperation. When they finally acknowledged me, it was with practiced patience, like they were indulging a difficult child. I stood, thanked them for their time, and said very little. I asked one question, carefully worded, about the basis of their claimed jurisdiction over my parcel. The lawyer answered confidently, referencing the same bylaws I'd already dismantled on paper. Then I asked if they were aware of the exclusion clause filed with the county in 1981, the one that permanently separated my land from association authority. The room shifted. Chairs creaked. The lawyer paused just long enough to tell me everything I needed to know. He asked for a copy. I told him it had already been sent to his office that morning. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't accused anyone of anything. I just sat back down. The meeting ended early. People left quickly, avoiding conversation, like they'd just witnessed something impolite. Outside, a few neighbors lingered, pretending to check their phones while watching me walk to my car. I didn't feel victorious. I felt settled. The kind of settled you feel when a long argument finally reaches the point where facts replace opinions. I knew what would happen next. The lawyer would review the documents. The board would panic quietly. And the HOA president, who had once kicked my door before sunrise, believing she had a master key to my life, would soon learn what it feels like to knock on the wrong property with no authority left to hide behind. The response didn't come right away, which told me more than any email ever could. When people are certain they're right, they reply quickly. When they're scrambling, they go quiet. Days passed, then a week. No fines, no notices taped to my door, no patrol car idling near my driveway at odd hours. It was the first real silence I'd had since all of this started, and instead of feeling relieved, I felt alert. Silence, in situations like this, is rarely peace. It's regrouping. During that quiet stretch, I didn't relax. I finalized everything. I pulled the full chain of title from the county recorder. Not just the summary, but the original transfers, handwritten margins and all. I requested certified surveys, both current and historical, and overlaid them digitally to show exactly where the HOA's authority ended and my land began. I filed a public records request for every agreement the association had ever signed involving utilities, access roads, or emergency services. That's when the pattern became undeniable. They'd been operating for years on implied control, not legal authority, leaning on homeowners who didn't know the difference and folding any time someone pushed back hard enough. I wasn't their first problem. I was just the first one with enough documentation to make it dangerous. At home, the tension showed in quieter ways. My partner stopped sleeping through the night. The dog stayed alert even when nothing was happening, picking up on the shift before we consciously acknowledged it. I kept the exterior lights on longer than usual, not out of fear, but habit. You don't ignore patterns when you've learned how quickly power can be abused. Every sound carried weight. Every vehicle slowing near the gate registered. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. The HOA finally resurfaced with a notice of mediation, framed as an olive branch, voluntary, cooperative, mutually beneficial. The language was softer now, careful, like they were stepping onto thin ice and knew it. I agreed to attend, not because I wanted compromise, but because mediation creates records, and records are leverage. We met in a neutral office downtown. Fluorescent lights, stale coffee, a long table meant to make everyone feel equally small. The HOA president was there, along with the lawyer and 2 board members who hadn't said much up to that point. They looked tired, defensive, less certain. They spoke first, outlining concerns about safety, access, and community harmony. I listened without interrupting. When it was my turn, I didn't argue feelings. I laid out facts, parcel numbers, filing dates, recorded exclusions. I explained calmly how their enforcement actions constituted trespass, harassment, and attempted coercion under state statute. I didn't threaten. I didn't raise the idea of damages. I just made it clear that the path they were on didn't end where they thought it did. The mediator's pen slowed. The lawyer stopped taking notes altogether and just listened. The meeting ended without resolution, but that was expected. Mediation rarely ends conflict, it clarifies risk. As we stood to leave, the HOA president tried to say something conciliatory, something about misunderstandings and stress. I nodded, polite but unmoved. Understanding isn't required when the law is clear. Outside, as we went our separate ways, I saw it in her posture for the first time. Uncertainty. Not anger, not arrogance. The realization that authority borrowed too long eventually comes due. That night, I drafted one final letter, reviewed by counsel, addressed to the board as a whole. It outlined my position, my evidence, and my intent to seek injunctive relief if harassment continued. It wasn't hostile. It was precise. The kind of document that doesn't bluff because it doesn't need to. I sent it certified, then shut my laptop and went to bed earlier than usual. For the first time in months, I slept without waiting for a knock that never came. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, which felt intentional in a way I couldn't quite prove. Middle of the week, middle of the workday, the kind of time slot designed to discourage witnesses and drain momentum. I took the day off anyway. I arrived early, parked where I knew I was allowed to, and walked in carrying a slim folder that looked unimpressive to anyone who didn't know what was inside. That folder represented months of quiet work, late nights, and restraint. It was heavier than it looked. The HOA board arrived together, clustered like a single organism trying to look confident. The president avoided eye contact. The lawyer didn't. He studied me carefully, the way someone does when they're recalculating odds they don't like. When we were called in, we took our places, and the room settled into that peculiar stillness that only happens when decisions are about to be made by people who didn't start the fight but will finish it anyway. I spoke when asked, and only when asked. I presented the deeds first, then the surveys, then the historical agreements that showed, beyond interpretation, that the HOA's claimed authority over my property had never existed. I explained how the access road they'd tried to control was explicitly excluded from their jurisdiction. I showed how their fines, threats, and late-night intimidation attempts constituted a pattern, not an accident. I didn't describe the 4 a.m. incident emotionally. I described it chronologically, clinically, like evidence deserves. The dogs were mentioned only insofar as they underscored how reckless the HOA's actions had been. The room stayed quiet. When the HOA's lawyer stood to respond, he didn't challenge the documents. He couldn't. Instead, he argued intent, misunderstanding, long-standing assumptions, community norms. The judge listened, nodded once, and then asked a single question about recorded authority. There was no good answer. Silence filled the space. Again, heavier this time, and I realized that this was the moment everything tipped, not dramatically, just definitively. The ruling came faster than I expected. Injunction granted. The HOA was ordered to cease all enforcement actions related to my property immediately. Any future contact would have to go through counsel. The judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Authority doesn't announce itself when it's real. As we stood, the HOA president's shoulders slumped. Not in defeat exactly, but in recognition. This wasn't something they could spin away at the next meeting. After that, things unraveled quickly. Board members resigned one by one. The lawyer quietly withdrew. Homeowners started asking questions they'd never asked before, comparing notes, sharing letters, realizing patterns they'd been too busy or too intimidated to see. Within months, the HOA was effectively non-functional, its power reduced to paperwork and memory. No dramatic dissolution announcement, just a slow, undeniable collapse. Life settled into something better than before. Quieter, yes, but also clearer. Neighbors who had avoided me started waving again, cautiously at first, then more openly. Some apologized without saying the word apology. Others just let the silence stand, which was enough. My home felt like mine again. Not a contested space, but a place of rest. The dogs relaxed. So did we. Sometimes people ask if it was worth it, all the stress and effort. I tell them the truth. I didn't do it to win. I did it to stop losing something that was never meant to be taken. Power, when it's unchecked, relies on people giving up quietly. I didn't. And now, when I walk my land in the early morning, the only thing that greets me is the sound of my own footsteps. Steady, unchallenged, and finally free.